From the courtroom. Again, we're awaiting the jury to come back. They have let the court know that they do have a verdict after 4 hours and 50 minutes of deliberations. And when they come in, we will take you there live for the reading of that verdict. 4 hours and 50 minutes. It's not a lot of time, Rich Schoenstein. As you mentioned earlier, you know, when you generally, and we've seen it, it's sort of been across the board here. And as you said, you and I have done a couple of different verdicts together. Normally, when you have a short deliberation, it's not good for the defendant. But we've seen it hasn't worked exactly across the board that way. But generally, that's the idea.
Right. Well, the one thing you know is that you got 12 people to come to a quick agreement one way or the other. And remember, you get 12 people, you put them in a room together, you have to select a four-person, that takes a little bit of time. Once you get a verdict, you have to fill out some forms, that takes a little bit of time. So if you are at 4 hours and 50 minutes, you had maybe 3 hours of actual active deliberation. And in that time, 12 people came to agree on something, guilty, not guilty. Hard to get 12 people in this country to agree on anything in 3 hours or even more time. So generally, the thinking in a murder case like this is if they agreed that quickly, they are agreeing to convict, because it would be unusual for 12 people that quickly to all agree that the state had failed to meet its burden of proof. Not impossible, we've seen it before, but it's more supportive of a guilty conviction than a not guilty.
Yeah, no question about it. And as we were bumping in there, we were looking at this defendant talking to the police. And, you know, we've always lamented the fact that when you're in any situation like this, the best thing to do is just not to talk to the police. So I started thinking, I said, would there still be a case had he not talked to the police? Not only in that first one, but actually on the second time when he did the walkthrough as well. And I said to myself, he probably would still have been at trial, because had he decided not to talk to police, he would have been suspect, right? So they talked to him, and some of the things he says makes him a suspect. But if he hadn't talked, they would have looked at him the same way and found some of the inconsistencies and some of the issues they found anyway.
Yeah, I don't think the talking helped him. You know me, I always say get a lawyer, whether you're guilty or you're innocent. If you're being questioned by the police about a double murder, you need a lawyer. And he needed one. He shouldn't have started talking. I don't think it helped him whatsoever. If he hadn't said a word to police ever, then this case would have come down to, you know, the guns. At least one of those guns that was found there had Miller's fingerprints, which indicated that he could have been at least one of the shooter. I think the defense still would have told a self-defense story as the theory of the case, and you wouldn't have had these kind of inconsistent statements to hurt him.
Yeah, they still would have looked at him. They still would have wanted, even if he just said fundamentally, hey, I saw this guy shot him, that's all I can remember. They would have probably wanted to look into it a little bit and found those phone calls and the connection between the two, and I think that might have raised flags as well. All right, Rich, stand by. I do want to take a break, folks. So there you heard it. Thomas Randolph wheeled out of the courtroom after hearing the verdict from this jury, guilty on all counts, conspiracy, guilty, first-degree murder in the death of Sharon Randolph, guilty, first-degree murder in the death of Michael Miller, guilty. And again, the judge basically set a sentencing date for October 12th. It'll be turned over to the Department of Probation to do a pre-sentencing report, which she will take into account. Of course, he is facing life in prison in this case. Not a surprise for a number of reasons. The state of the state's case, as well as the amount of time of deliberation. Still with me to discuss is trial attorney Rich Schoenstein. And Rich, got to first of all get your reaction to the verdict here.
It was the verdict you and I were both expecting, and I think the jury got it right. It's consistent with the evidence presented in the case. The self-defense story didn't really hold up. There was far too much contact between him and Miller, and far too many things were suspicious. So it's the end of the line for Thomas Randolph. He was convicted previously. He got that overturned on appeal. He did get the death penalty taken off the table, but he's going to spend the rest of his life in jail, and there's not going to be a successful appeal of this conviction.
Yeah, I agree. I don't see that happening as well, and not a lot of reaction from him as the verdicts were read. He seemed to take it in stride there. You know, sometimes it takes a little time for these things to kick in, but he is going to spend the rest of his life in prison for sure. He was called an unreliable narrator by the prosecution, which I thought was really a great label to place on him, just reminding this jury to continually look at his story. Because at the end of the day, Rich, it was his story that really started and really ended this entire case.
Yeah, I agree with that. His story was suspicious to begin with. It didn't hold up. It didn't stay consistent with all the other evidence in the case. And then, as we said, Michael, he didn't get it on the stand to back it up. He's claiming self-defense, but he didn't look that jury in the eye and tell him it was self-defense. That makes it really hard. I think the prosecution did a great job here. As you and I were discussing, I think the defense did a pretty good job too, but this verdict is consistent with the evidence.
And the other thing we have to remember, Rich, I'm sorry, the other thing we have to remember is that now this provides at least some measure of closure for the family members. We saw a shot of them hugging prosecutors, always a very, you know, it's a difficult time because you have winners and losers in this case, but everyone really in a case like this, no one is a winner per se. I mean, this is a case where justice was done, and that's what we look for in these cases, but those families will never be made whole.
No, you can't do that. You can't repair people who have had loved ones murdered by convicting the murderer. It helps. You hope it helps. You want to get justice and you want to make it better for the families, but you're never going to put them back in the position they were before. They're never going to be the same. It's a horrible circumstance for the survivors.
Rich, if you look at the evidence in the case, and there was a number of things. There were the inconsistencies in the stories. There was this relationship that he had with Mike Miller. There was the insurance policy, and they focused in on the money motive. The ski mask was also problematic, where he apparently shot him with the ski mask when he told the story, but there was no hole or blood on the ski mask. Of those inconsistencies, so to speak, what do you think was the most telling for this jury?
So I don't know what was the most telling for the jury. For me, what stood out was just the amount of contact he had with Miller under really odd circumstances. This is some guy he just randomly met. There's a story about him being a handyman, but it doesn't seem like he was handy at anything or did anything. And there's just a volume of contact between the two of them that was so unusual, and no real reason that Miller would then show up and try to rob him and kill the wife. And then, by the way, not kill Randolph, who he encounters afterwards. I mean, the story just didn't make sense. I don't know if there's any single thing that stands up, except maybe the amount of contact he had with Miller.
Yeah, I would have to agree. That really was just odd circumstance. The other thing that stood out for me, Rich, was the testimony of a couple of detectives talking about what turned their eyes towards Thomas Randolph. And there was the coincidences, the idea that this is a guy that he had happened to befriend and then call over 200 times in the 3 months before the murder. This is the guy that's actually at the house, robbing his house, even though he knew that Thomas and his wife were going to be away the following day or two, that he could have robbed the house if he wanted to do it then. And then ultimately, he ends up shooting him there in the house, shooting the wife first, and then he shoots Mike Miller. All those coincidences, it was just too much to bear, and that's what turned their eyes towards him. And at the end of the day, I think that evidence all sort of played in this jury's decision as well. All right, Rich Schoenstein, thank you so much for joining me again. Another verdict for the two of us. Always a pleasure to have you with us. Now, today we'll have more coverage of the guilty verdict in the widower murder retrial coming up.